Ambassador Dennis Ross is the Counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He also now teaches at Georgetown University Center for Jewish Civilization. And for more than 12 years, Ambassador Ross played a leading role in shaping US involvement in the Middle East peace process, dealing directly with the parties as the US point man on the peace process in both the George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton administrations. Instrumental in helping Israelis and Palestinians reach the 1995 interim agreement, he also successfully brokered the 97 Hebron Accord, facilitated the 1994 Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty, and intensively worked to bring Israel and Syria together. Later, served 2.5 years as Special Assistant to President Obama as National Security Council Senior Director for the Central Region, spending the first 6 months of the administration as a Special Advisor on Iran to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Ambassador Ross is the author of 5 books on the Middle East peace process, the Middle East and international relations, which I can attest to all are excellent and insightful reads. His next book, Statecraft 2.0, What America Needs to Lead in a Multipolar World, will be published by Oxford University Press in February 2025. Ambassador Dennis Ross, what a delight to have you on this show. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks. Good to be with you again.
Good to be with you again too. Firstly, a little bit about before we go into the story, I like to get a bit of background on people. You've been in the peace process from the American Council perspective for a long time. If I may ask, just what are some of the key lessons you've learned? We stand at a world very different to the world it's been. We'll talk about that. But just reflecting, what are some of the key learns, issues, insights?
You know, it won't surprise you. There's quite a few lessons I've learned. Many of them reflect a kind of common sense, but this is not a conflict that's often been characterized by common sense. I think one of the most profound things that any American administration needs to understand, if it's going to get into some kind of serious process with Israelis and Palestinians, but I would even say with Israelis and Arabs more generally, both sides have to be prepared to assume a set of responsibilities. Both sides have to be accountable. If they make commitments, then you have to hold them to their commitments. I can't say we always did that successfully in the past. I can say frequently we didn't hold sides accountable, and we should have. Secondly, if we're asking both sides to make big deals, if they say they're serious and ready to make these big decisions, don't take that at face value. Require them to say something publicly that will be difficult for them, that will invite opposition, because their readiness to do that indicates they're ready to make big decisions, and it also means they'll want very quickly to show what they got for this. So that means you're creating an impetus to move. It is the hesitancy on each side to say things that will invite opposition, and always waiting for the other side to do it, that is what has typified this process. Thirdly, and when I'm saying that second point, if we're going to make a serious commitment ourselves, we have to have some proof on the other side that they're up to it and they're ready for it.
Sorry for interrupting, but this is about Israel and the Palestinians, not one or the other. It's both, the commitment and accountability for both.
It is. But what I'm saying now is a lesson when we went to Camp David in the year 2000, the summer of 2000, only on day 3 did I realize what I should have come up with before we went. I had this elaborate strategy, which the president had accepted. And then the first day of Camp David, when Barack said no to him, he just dropped the strategy. Mostly because he said, look, Barack's the one who's having to make the bigger concessions. I'm not going to try to jam him. But what occurred to me afterwards was we should have required Barak and Arafat to say before they would come that publicly, and we could have synchronized it, that they each understood they were not going to get 100% of what they wanted on Jerusalem, refugees, borders, and security. That these were historic decisions that were required, and that they'd have to compromise on these issues. Not say we understand we have to compromise in general. No, say explicitly, here are areas where we're going to have to compromise. Now, I will tell you, Barak would have grudgingly done it. Arafat would not have done it. And had we known that, then we would have said, okay, look, we're not going to go for a summit when, with Chairman Arafat, you're not up to, I mean, it's not a judgment. I mean, it's an observation of reality. If you can't do this, you can't do it. But then let's focus on what we can do. Let's not chase the unachievable. And with him, he was not up to it. Because for a lot of reasons, he he saw himself as someone who never foreclosed options. He saw himself as sort of the last Palestinian nationalist. And he wasn't prepared to close doors and say, I'm ending the conflict, I'm ending all claims, I'm ending all grievance. He wasn't prepared to do that. And that's what we needed to test in advance. He could say these things to us privately, but having him say it publicly put him in a position where he was going to come under pressure, and that gave him an incentive to then show that he could produce something that justified this.
It's if I may,
Yeah.
you use three words there that in my writing and in communication with our Foreign Minister Penny Wong, on a number of times I've asked, please use the words end of conflict.
Yes.
If we're going to get serious about this, both sides must come to an agreement that whatever we do is a step to or is end of conflict. Otherwise, we perpetuate the wiggle room, as I think you've described, if you agree with me, that allows all of the players to find a way to perpetuate anything but an end of conflict. I find it extraordinary. It's not the language that's used.
That actually was exactly the issue. That was the problem with Arafat. That this was end the conflict, which meant that no more grievances, no more claims, no more struggle. And he couldn't personally redefine himself that way.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not excusing Barak, because Barak made commitments and didn't live up to them. And that's what I mean about accountability. But so these are the most important lessons. There are other lessons as well, which is to think through the objectives you can actually achieve. And it's fine to be ambitious in terms of, that's actually what my new book is about with statecraft. Good statecraft is always characterized by marrying objectives and means. And it is remarkable how rarely we do that. It seems, I teach a course in this as well, and I say to my students, so that's just a given, right? Marrying objectives and means. Why would you pursue any policy if you couldn't marry your objectives and means? And yet, it's more the exception than the rule, for lots of reasons.
Yes, it is. And
political reasons,
political reasons,
factors,
all of
so
it.
forth.
I agree with you. It's actually a really good segue. I'm sorry for interrupting, but it is a good segue, conscious of time, to the conversation around October 7th and post-October 7th. Hamas's, the disconnect between objectives and means, right? The objective is to destroy Israel. The means was, barbarism, but it was never going to happen in the sense of what they wanted, right? So the question, I want to ask the more strategic questions of you at this point. How has Hamas's attack and the consequence of the war transformed the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East, particularly concerning US foreign policy and Israel's security strategy? What are the big changes in the landscape?
Look, the most remarkable changes that also show how misguided Yahya Sinwar was and how profoundly Hassan Nasrallah miscalculated, and Ali Khamenei miscalculated. The Israelis have transformed through their military achievements the balance of power in the region. It's very interesting that at the outgoing administration, President Biden and the people like Jake Sullivan who work for him were emphasizing, to some degree, taking credit for it, which in part it was deserved, in part it was not deserved, but saying they were laying out, look at what's changed now. Hezbollah has been decimated. Well, it was the Israelis who decimated them. Iran has lost its strategic air and missile defense and 90% of its ballistic missile producing capability. The most important link in what Iran called its forward defense was the Bashar al-Assad regime. It's gone. The ability to rebuild and reconstitute Hezbollah depended upon having that logistic land bridge. It's gone. So you have a balance of power that has changed fundamentally. The real issue is how do you translate that so it's not just a tactical gain, but an enduring strategic gain? And here we have an incoming administration that, with President Trump, has enormous leverage. Now the question is he equipped, is his administration equipped to know how to apply that leverage to produce outcomes? And time will tell whether that's the case. You have an administration that is strongly supportive of Israel verbally, and will be supportive of it, I think, politically. Whether it's as supportive of Israel from a financial standpoint as Biden was, I'm not sure that's a given. Biden produced a $16 billion supplemental just for Israel.
Yeah, it was fantastic. It was extraordinary what he did.
And Biden also deployed massive forces twice. I said financially support, but also militarily support. Trump has said he'll release the weapons. That there's one set of weapons that Biden was withholding, 2,000-pound bombs. But we put 2 aircraft carriers in the region. We put our most powerful nuclear-powered sub, which carried a whole arsenal of offensive missiles and cruise missiles. We put destroyers in there with Aegis anti-missile capabilities. And on the night of April 13th, and then again on October 1st, U.S. forces were there to help Israel in the interception of Iranian ballistic missiles that were being fired, cruise missiles and drones as well, that were being fired at Israel. Israel did an extraordinary job on its own, but the nature of its task was not as great as it would have been if it hadn't been for the U.S. also contributing. Israel could avoid a whole array of missiles being launched because they had the U.S. dealing with them. So, whether President Trump will be prepared to be as supportive in that sense, both financially and in terms of the U.S. military, that remains to be seen. Symbolically and politically and rhetorically, he will be.
They sound all in. They sound all in.
Right.
Here's
Absolutely.
the catch. Here's the catch. So, President Trump's diplomacy is best characterized, or I've read, is characterized as transactional, right? The art of the deal. That's the way he does things. So he's pivoting away from multilateralism, which traditionally, American administrations are very good at that. So how should Israel's security calculus evolve in this world of Trumpian transactionalism, especially as the multipolar world we now live in, with the power dispersed throughout the access of Iran and North Korea and Russia and China. So what risks does this pose specifically for Israel, this transactional diplomatic approach?
I think there's a couple of different ways to look at it. Let me start with the positive way. From an Israeli standpoint, the smart thing to do is to reach some strategic understandings with Trump as early as possible on how the approach to Iran is going to work. Because Iran is dramatically weaker than it was for reasons I said before. without getting into how weak it is economically right now, I just focused on the military weakness, the vulnerability there. Now is the time to reach an agreement with Trump on what's the objective, getting back to objectives and means, what's the objective? Is it to ensure that the Iranian nuclear program is reduced to the point where they no longer even have an option of having a nuclear weapon? Very hard to achieve because the Iranians have spent a lot of time and money building this capability. But if they understand the consequence of not reaching a deal is not only a draconian economic set of sanctions put on them, but also, if they don't respond, a readiness to use force to destroy the nuclear infrastructure, which they've spent over 30 years building and more than $500 billion.
So
So,
the lead question is, do you think that this administration will ask Israel, it's a pretty bold question, but do you think they'll ask Israel to strike the Iranian nuclear facilities?
I think that Trump will try to use the Israeli threat of military force with our support for it, as opposed to our participation in it, because he's presented himself, the critical line that he used in his inaugural speech yesterday was, we measure success not on battles won, but on wars ended, and most importantly, on wars avoided, wars we didn't get into. So he wants to present himself as a peacemaker, and he'll use maximum pressure, meaning economic pressure, but he can use the threat of Israeli force with our support for it to convince the Iranians that they could lose their entire military nuclear infrastructure unless they're prepared to reach an agreement. I think it's very important for Israel to reach an understanding on what the strategy is. And if Trump agrees that if diplomacy doesn't work, he will support the use of force, the Israelis then need to get from him certain capabilities we have never provided Israel. One of which is the massive ordnance penetrator. There's one nuclear site, enrichment site, in Fordo, which is a mountain, that Israel doesn't have the means to destroy. We developed something called a massive ordnance penetrator during the Obama administration to be able to destroy it. They don't have a plane that could carry the bomb. It's 30,000 pounds. It has a fuse that ignites only after it gets deep underground. They don't have a plane to carry it, so we would have to allow them to use B-2s to carry it. But if, for example, and this would be a way to underpin the diplomacy to give it credibility. If Trump was to announce we're going to provide the MOP to the Israelis, that would send a signal to the Israelis.
Yeah.
If he was to commit to also providing the same kind of level of support that Biden did, if it comes to this, meaning they will be in the region to help in the defense of Israel, if and when Iran responds, these are the things that the Prime Minister of Israel would need to work out in advance with Trump. So I answer your question on multipolarity because no one else is going to play the role with Israel when it comes to the possible threat of force against the Iranian nuclear infrastructure.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to Israel's political isolation in the world, this is where multipolarity matters.
So
it is very important for Israel to be able to end the war in Gaza, to change the climate, which will make it easier for many of those who at this point feel under pressure, not only to isolate Israel politically, but you look at the French, who didn't allow the Israelis to participate in this annual military show that they have.
Even though there were French citizens being held by Hamas in Gaza, I found it an extraordinary thing that a country's citizens are being held hostage without access to the Red Cross, and yet they blamed Israel in terms of taking action. Now, we can understand the possibility of the politics of that vis-a-vis, French society, the growth of the Muslims. That's a simplist. I think it's a simplistic view. But the deeper question is, how should Israel adapt its strategy to counter this growing anti-Israel sentiment all through the world, in all
Yeah.
of its global forums. And the task seems almost impossible right now. So what should Israel do?
Look, one of the problems is this Israeli government, Itamar Ben Gvir has just resigned, but Minister Smotrich has not. They say things that amount to ethnic cleansing, saying, we want to voluntarily have the Palestinians leave Gaza, and we want to do the same thing in the West Bank. We want to annex the West Bank. It's very hard to change the image of Israel when you have ministers like that who will say whatever they want to say with no coalition discipline whatsoever. It's very difficult, so long as this government remains intact, for Israel to change the imagery because they play into the narrative against them. So, for one thing, the reason I focus on the issue of if you end the war in Gaza and you get out of Gaza, it begins to change the climate. I do think something's going to give in Israel politically. It will be very difficult for Bibi to maintain this coalition if he fulfills the three phases of the hostage deal. And yet at the same time, the U.S., and this is the Trump administration now, because President Trump celebrated this deal, called it epic, and basically claimed credit for it. Well, this deal also requires the U.S. to be a guarantor of the implementation of the deal. Smotrich is telling Prime Minister Netanyahu, if you do the second phase, which means negotiating a permanent ceasefire and withdrawing from Gaza, yes, you get all the remaining hostages, live hostages at that point. I will pull out of the government, and then you won't have a majority.
Yes.
So basically, Bibi's going to have to choose between the pressure he's going to be under from Trump and Smotrich, unless, and this is possible, that basically Hamas violates and allows him to resume the war.
Or, and this was, if I may, was explained to me in February last year, that Bibi's road to re-election is through the Saudi normalisation deal. That is of such significance. It is so huge in the geopolitical landscape. I mean, you've written about achieving Israel-Saudi normalisation, if I can quote, could lead to profound regional transformation, and I think a global one too. We'll have countries like Indonesia, and it's massive. So, if that's Bibi's road to re-election, and it would be an extraordinary achievement, most likely done under a Trump administration under the Abraham Accords, which Trump, who's not very tactful, has already come out and said, then he doesn't need that. And Bibi goes, the coalition falls, the ceasefire agreement stays, Saudi normalisation comes in. That's the other road. What are the chances of that lining up in that way?
Well, there is a chance for sure, but it gets back to what I was saying. One of the realities we face today is we have two publics that are completely suffering from trauma. For the Israeli public, so long as hostages are held, this is still October 7th, 2023.
Yeah.
And so long as there's no accountability for what happened then, it's still October 7th, 2023. So that's on their side. And when you're in Israel, and I just got back from 3 weeks in Israel, nobody sees the imagery in Gaza in Israel. Nobody. It's just not shown. And my explanation for that is when you're suffering from trauma, no one should expect you to be mindful of anybody else's pain, even the ability to absorb it. But you have an absolute mirror image on the Palestinian side and in the Arab world. You travel throughout the Arab countries as I have, and all you see are these horrific images in Gaza. And that's affected the Saudis. So what they require, first and foremost, is the war in Gaza ends and the process of reconstruction in Gaza can be seen as beginning. And that won't happen until Israel's out of Gaza. So this is a precondition. It's kind of a necessary but not sufficient condition, because they will also want something that demonstrates that they've achieved for Palestinians what no one else has achieved, which is not necessarily now you got a Palestinian state, but you have an approach that is more tangible and more promising than anything up until now. And I would say the administration, just as I started at the outset, everybody has to be responsible and accountable, and everybody has to have responsibilities. For the administration to produce this for the Saudis also requires something of the Saudis other than just normalization. They need to use the leverage they have on Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, to clean up the Palestinian Authority. It is
Can they
weak,
do that?
too corrupt.
Can they do it? We know about the PA. It's a kleptocratic regime, right?
It is.
Is there? There's two things. Firstly, I want to go back one step. What I'm hearing from you about, Israel, Gaza, ceasefire, Saudi Arabia, is the ducks actually have to line up in a particular row, right? It's
Yes.
not just throw them out on the board and see where they land. For
right.
it to work in the way you've described, which is the massive geopolitical change, there has to be phase two. There has to be an end to the war. There has to be something in it for the Palestinians. Agree with it or not? I mean, I think you and I, most human beings would agree. Not at the cost of Israel, of course. That's our lesson. And then the Saudi arrangement. But in that sequence, the Israeli government will fall and we go to an election in that, for that to line up.
That's
But the assumption is that
absolutely.
PA can run Gaza and it's not capable.
No, that's you have to have an interim administration that is a combination of regional states and international players together.
Yeah. Okay.
And that has to exist for 18 to 24 months. And in parallel with that, you have to be seriously reforming the PA, and gradually it can come in and be part of this administration. That's what's required.
Is it reformable?
It was. You go 2007 to 2012 when Salam Fayyad was the prime minister, absolutely.
Yes, it was. That's
He
true.
quickly, think about it. When he became prime minister, there was no law and order throughout the West Bank. Every city was sort of run by gangs. The Fatah had just lost all of its credibility because it had been booted out of Gaza. He came in because he was basically, George H.W. Bush told Mahmoud Abbas, you will appoint him and empower him, and he will be independent. You will stay out of his way, or we will cut you off, and everyone else. We'll make sure everybody else cuts you off.
But it didn't last. He couldn't.
5 years.
Oh,
5
okay.
years.
Okay.
All right. And eventually, and then this was a big mistake of the Obama administration, because when Abu Mazen was clear he wanted to get rid of Salam Fayyad, the position of the administration should have been, you can't do that, and if you do that, we cut you off.
So did you give that
We didn't
advice
do that.
to the president? You were his special assistant. Did you give him that advice, President Obama?
Sure, absolutely, I give that advice. John Kerry was Secretary of State at that time, and we didn't lean in the way we should have. Just look, we should have leaned in when Abu Mazen sought to create the appearance of reform by appointing a new prime minister, Mohammed Mustafa, who is, from an expertise standpoint, from a functional background standpoint, he is equipped. The problem is he doesn't have 1 ounce of independence. He can't change anything. And by the way, he was appointed, I think last January, and he has changed nothing.
So the question is, do European countries, Australia included, we've shifted into the European view of the conflict, I think, very much so, away from the American perspective to the European perspective.
Yeah.
Should we keep funding the Palestinian Authority the way it is, or does money talk in that world that would force change? And if that's not the road, what is the road for reformation?
Look, I think that just as I was saying before in the bigger lessons, you do the Palestinians no favor. You don't make a Palestinian state any more likely if you never require responsibility from them. If the EU has been urging reform for a long time, and they've withheld some money, but they need to adopt a position where they basically say, if you don't reform, then we will provide, we will provide projects, we will provide no cash.
Yeah. Okay. So you don't just say the words, put your actions behind them, like in all
You
things.
have to. Because I said,
Yeah.
I want to see a Palestinian state.
Yeah.
I do. But I don't want a failed Palestinian state. I don't want to see a Palestinian state that is run by extremists.
Yeah.
I don't want a Palestinian state that can be aligned with the Iranians. I don't want a Palestinian state that is still based on the premise of resistance, not coexistence. In other words, and this is one of the things, by the way, Europeans who have recognized a Palestinian state with no conditions, again, they don't make that state more likely. If you want Palestinians to understand that what is required of them are a set of responsibilities. I pushed the last administration, why don't you adopt a position where you say, we recognize the Palestinians as a people, because they are, and as a people, they have a right to self-determination, but they don't have a right to act on that until they've fulfilled a set of tangible things on the ground. They're both tangible and intangible in terms of public commitments, rhetorical political commitments.
Which has always been the American view, the Australian view, and many other responsible nations. I need to tell you that, and I'm not sure how much you're following what's going on here, other than the fact that the anti-Semitism is out of control here, and that's another conversation I'd like to have with you. But the chances here, we have a Labor government, equivalent to the Democrats, more left of the Democrats in power. We have an election probably somewhere between March and May this year. And the way the two major parties are polling, they'll be minority, and they'll have to go into coalition with independents of various denominations and colours, including the Greens party here. If it's Labor that gets asked, they'll have to go in with the Greens. The Greens here are outright anti-Semites. Just outright. It's a disaster. It's a complete disaster, Dennis. And one of the conditions they've given publicly to joining Labor if they make a minority government is unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state. Now, if Penny stays on, she'll probably do that in June. If we have a May election, there'll be a coalition. And then there's a June conference, if I recall, following up the last UN resolutions on sovereignty. So that would be the time for that to happen. Our fear here, and that's politics, right? That's the price of government. Like it, not like it, that's the way it is. But our fear here, Dennis, is it only will embolden the extremists who have been taking out their anger on the Jewish community, who've been setting fire to our shuls and now our kindergartens. The other day in Sydney, I don't know if you saw the news, but a preschool in the streets. And the government may know that, but that's their price of getting into government. And that's our real concern here, that the unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state, whether it's good or bad or right or wrong, in the scheme of things, it may or may not have any impact, but it emboldens the extremists. I'm agreeing with you, and that's why I'm making the point. It tells the Palestinian Authority they can maintain the internationalization of their conflict and not deal with their responsibilities. How do we deal with all this?
You know, that's why I would try to say, okay, you want to unilaterally recognize, why don't you say, we're prepared to recognize now a Palestinian state once we see this is a state that cannot be led by Hamas or other rejectionists. This is a state that will commit to never being part of an in alignment with Iran or other rejectionist states, uh, provided we see that the basic narrative is about coexistence, not resistance, provided we see a range of reforms, including a commitment to the rule of law in practice, so that this is not a failed state. Why would we recognize a state that's going to fail? The Middle East does not need another failed state.
Yeah.
So create a series of conditions that Palestinians themselves should want to meet, because if they don't meet it, A, they won't have a state, and they will continue to perpetuate what has been their approach. I met someone today from Egypt. I won't say who it was, but we were talking about Palestinians today and the Trump administration. And I said one of the big mistakes that Abu Mazen made was he boycotted the Trump administration after he moved our embassy to Jerusalem. By the way, the embassy is in West Jerusalem, which, according to the so-called, if you take June 467, West Jerusalem's in the pre-June 467 lines.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've been there. It's in a beautiful position, overlooking the Judean desert. It's an extraordinary. It's an amazing. And yeah, my cousin lives around the corner from it, and we walk by it and it's beautiful. It's beautiful. Yeah, in Talpiot, it's an amazing spot.
Right, it is an amazing spot, but it's also
Yeah, it's on this side.
67 lines.
Yeah.
So that was a mistake. And then when the Trump plan came out, January 28th, 2020, it provided for two states. Now, it didn't have the boundaries that, that the Palestinians want. But at the time, Jared Kushner was saying, this is an initial proposal. Let the Palestinians come and give a counter proposal. But of course, they boycotted and did nothing. The old Abba Eban adage that the Palestinians never miss an opportunity, it's when you make yourself a victim as a strategy, not as a condition. Are Palestinians victims? 100%. But when you make it not a condition, but a strategy, the one thing you guarantee, you'll always be a victim.
And didn't President Clinton at the Sharm conference say it's time to move past old grievances in order to seize the opportunities that come from an agreement? I mean, if I recall, and you would have been there. I mean, did he say that?
Yes. I mean, look, he said, look, we can replay history over and over again. We're not asking either side to give up their history or their historical narrative. Okay, you own it. It's yours. But we're asking you not to allow your grievances from the past to limit what you can do so you can have a future.
So when victimhood is your narrative or identity,
right,
then you go for a maximalist strategy, which doesn't allow you to find the compromise tools. I mean, that's clear. So my question is, let me ask you this: in light of all of this, in this incredibly tumultuous year and a half, where do you think the Israel-Palestine conflict, I'm separating Gaza for the minute, but where is the Israel-Palestine conflict up to? And what lies ahead with the next generation of, if these leaders are not capable, then, and they're all 70s or 80s, and I think Abu Mazen's mother lived to 100, so we've still got some years left. But what lies ahead with these leaders, and what lies beyond them with the next generation? What do you think?
I want to answer, but I want to answer it this way. you have with Minister Smotrich someone who wants to change the realities on the ground to the point where a Palestinian state would never be possible. And he's creating new realities. And I think part of the trade-off, as I said before, that Prime Minister Netanyahu will offer him for going along with what Trump may require is he gets a free hand in the West Bank. But if he has a free hand in the West Bank, two things are going to happen. One, there'll be no Saudi normalization because they'll not normalize in a context where a Palestinian state is impossible. And two, he will create a one-state reality that is very difficult to reverse. So if you want Palestinians who are more moderate and pragmatic to emerge, they're much less likely to emerge in that kind of an environment. Although what it will produce, I'll tell you, because I've already seen it, Palestinians who are under 30 right now today say, we don't mind one state. In fact, from their standpoint, they'd like Israel to run it. Just give us our rights. Now, the problem is when you have that, then you no longer have a Zionist state of Israel, meaning you no longer have a Jewish democratic state.
As Micah Goodman called it, it's catch 67.
Yeah.
It's catch 67. You have a smaller Israeli state that's Jewish and secure, or you have a larger one state that is less Jewish and Zionist because you've incorporated the citizenry.
Right.
And anything in between that, an exclusion based on race, well, we're not going to go there. Got it.
Well, you know what it means. You know what it leads to. And so, I mean, look, there's an interesting irony. The left wants one state because they think there's this fantasy where, everyone will live together. And it's a fantasy because you have two national identities rooted in the land. Neither one is going to give up their identity. So what they will do is they will fight each other. The one state's a prescription for perpetual conflict. The right thinks that the Palestinians will just give up or leave or accept a status less than citizen. So they each have, the right has an illusion of what one state is, and the left has an illusion of what one state is. It's not that two states is a great outcome. It's very hard to produce. The reality is either two states or some combination of confederation where effectively you, under an umbrella, you still have two states, but under some kind of confederal umbrella, you don't have an answer to deal with the issue of national identity, which we have seen how committed the Israelis are to preserving their state. Think about how they fought this war, even though about 3/4 of the public don't trust the government. It's actually quite astounding to see the lack of faith in the Israeli government, and yet people are, including people, the reservists, some of whom I've talked to who've spent 300 days since October 23rd.
Yeah, it's
while there's a segment of the population that is exempt.
Yeah, the burden, I mean, that's a whole nother conversation, and the burden in Israel is
not
very
shared.
unfair, very unfair. And we saw the news, daytime, your time, overnight, my time, that the IDF Chief of Staff, Halevi, and Southern Command have both tended, they always said they would. They believe now is the appropriate time to do so. So accountability will occur. Do you think that will flow all the way into the politics, that the nation will want now that accountability of a resignation of government?
It won't satisfy the public because they believe the military, intelligence bear responsibility, which is true, but they also think the government does.
Yeah.
So, look, you're in a situation where accountability, there's a couple things required for accountability. One of the things the military hasn't done, and it needs to do, is not, the fact that there was strategic surprise. This is the second time Israel has had strategic surprise, 73 and now.
Yeah.
We had it in Pearl Harbor, we had it in 9/11. Cases of strategic surprise are never the result of not having the information you need. They're always the result of misreading the information you have because of a set of assumptions that create kind of a prism through which you read it. So they had an assumption that Hamas had no interest in war. And they discounted everything that they had, that some of the intelligence people, especially the women intelligence units, were seeing. And it wasn't reported up the chain. Um, the proof of the contrast, look at how thoroughly they penetrated Hezbollah and thoroughly they penetrated Iran.
Yeah.
They could kill Ismail Haniyeh in a Tehran safe house with the only one who died being Haniyeh and his bodyguard because they blew up the room he was in. They could do that. They could wipe out the entire leadership of Hezbollah. They had these both so thoroughly penetrated. The contrast with what they had there and what they didn't have with Hamas is striking. So strategic surprise, the issue is not did you have what you needed? You had it, but you misread it. But the issue is why did it take 8 to 12 hours to get down to the south? There's no good explanation for that. And the public needs to hear that and
Yes.
see accountability.
So what a very thin slice in that, Dennis, is the show before this that aired last Monday is a soldier I know. I can't mention his name. He's in military intelligence. He was in the southern division, the Negev division, next to the Gazan border. He described the first hours of the attack on October 7. And there are clues in that. That's all I can say. So I recommend the podcast.
Yeah.
There are clues in why it took so long, because essentially Hamas very cleverly took out Israel's complete chain of command in the south. And in the absence of the chain of command, he said, one of the things he did say was on the phones and on the communication systems, all they could hear for hours was soldiers going, what should I do? Where should I go? When the chain of command was absent, it created a vacuum. And when leaders started coming down the south, they were picked off because they didn't realize how far in Hamas was and were being ambushed. This is one story of one example of how they saw it, but the wider failure, 100%. But what I wanted to do, and we've only got a few more minutes, this has just been so instructive and so insightful. The next generation of Palestinian leadership.
Yeah.
What's Israeli leadership? Who knows? Same old, unfortunately, it looks like. But tell us about the people you know and what the next generation of Palestinian leadership looks like.
I mean, one of the reasons you want to create a more hopeful climate is in a more hopeful climate, people are more prepared to take risks. The people who might not otherwise decide, look, I want to make myself visible for political reasons. I've had a Palestinian who's in his early 30s, works for an international company. I don't want to describe him beyond that. He actually said to me, look, should I try to go in now and get into the Palestinian Authority? And I said, no, because it's a dead end right now. If they open it up and reform, absolutely. He said, look, there are a lot of people like me. I have a whole group of people I'd actually like you to meet the next time you come, who are well-educated like me, ready to contribute to our society, want to have a different future. And I said, that's why the issue of reform is so important, because it needs to open up possibilities for Palestinians. They are an extremely well-educated population.
Yeah.
They have the highest advanced degree per capita of anybody in the Arab world. You look around, you look at Palestinians around the globe in their diaspora communities, they're all successful.
Very successful. Very
So it's
successful.
not, they can come in and they can build a state and run it if they have the opportunity to do it. But in an atmosphere where it's kind of ongoing, a kind of sense where the extremes dominate. extremes on each side need each other.
Yeah.
If if they didn't exist, then it's hard to justify themselves. If we can get to a point where the extremes are not the dominant, then this younger cohort of very smart, very talented Palestinians can emerge. I had one young Palestinian, a woman who was 30 something. I said, "What do you guys want?" She said, "For real?" I said, "Yeah, for real." She said, "You know, we like a good job. We like to be able, like to be able to drink beer, and we like to be able to go to the beach from time to time."
It's
You
very
talked about
human. It's very human. It's very empathic, and it's what we all want. It's what we all want.
President Clinton on uh, September 13th, 1993, in his speech with Rabin and Arafat there for the Declaration of Principles signing. The most memorable line from his speech, that both sides want the quiet miracle of a normal life.
Yeah. My last question. Thank you for that. My last question. I interviewed Colonel Mike Kelly, who's also an Assistant Defence Minister here. Wonderful, wonderful man. A couple of weeks ago, he quoted, and this is just a broad brush picture. He quoted the report from the VDEM Institute at the University of Gothenburg. 71% of the world's population, 5.7 billion, live in autocracies, and increase from 48% 10 years ago. Democracies going backwards.
Yeah.
We're in retreat. Russia, China, North Korea, long march, and I'm using the Gramsci expression particularly. They're on their long march to autocratic domination. The US, those of us that believe and still do is the greatest force for good in the world, is in retreat. And under the Trump administration seems to be in a more isolationist position at a critical time in history, when global leadership is required so much from it. How do you think this is going to play out in the next 4 years?
Well, my new book is geared entirely towards how to sustain American leadership. Donald Trump is not an isolationist. He fits a tradition. There's a number of traditions that we have. He used the word exceptional and exceptionalism in his speech yesterday. We have always seen ourselves as being exceptional. Now, that had two sides to the coin in terms of implications. There were those who said, we're so exceptional, we shouldn't sully ourselves by involvement with others, commitments to others. We should stand aloof from it, and we can be a model for others, but we shouldn't try to export this. There were others who said, no, it's our gift to the rest of the world to bring what we have to the rest of the world. The George W. Bush said, freedom was God's gift to everybody, and it was, in a lot of ways, he said, we have the responsibility to help create this freedom agenda. So Donald Trump fits the unilateralist side of that tradition, which is transactional, which is doesn't love alliances because that implies obligations, but it doesn't mean he's prepared to necessarily withdraw. He is someone who associates us with great success, like we're going to win like never before. And if we really sort of withdraw, we'll be losing like never before. So I don't take it as a given, as long as the people around him can present the choices in terms of what constitutes a win and what constitutes a loss.
Okay, so
and
my
and
last question. I'm sorry. Go on. Sorry.
I'm saying, it remains to be seen how he will operate.
Yeah.
We're in day 2 of the Trump administration, so it's a little early.
Little early, but given what you know of the characters, right? Given what you know of the people, given how much decades of service to the cause of America and Israel, Dennis Ross, are you optimistic looking forward, or less so now?
I always like to say I'm not optimistic or pessimistic, I'm realistic. And I believe there are interests that we have that have helped to shape where we are today. I don't think those interests disappear. Much depends upon how we act on those interests, and living up to obligations and commitments is one way to ensure that others will do so as well. But one thing about Trump, which is fair, he wants others to either pay their fair share or assume part of the burden. That's fair. And I think it's also fair to say too often we didn't insist, and we should have. So the part of him that says others have to do this, that can't be married to the fact if they do, we won't. You can't have it both ways. They got to do more, but we won't do anything. That won't work because then they won't do more. But the idea that only we have to carry the entire burden, it's wrong and it's not sustainable here. So,
and in
look,
this
I'm
and in this arena, in this world, it does require all of us, I agree, all of us to step in and share the burden of the protection, promotion, defence of democracy and liberty. Ambassador Dennis Ross, it has been a complete treat and a great honour to have you on our show, and thank you for your leadership and guidance over the years and in helping us point our future together. And as the year progresses, unfolds, I will be reaching out to you, and when things, as they always do, change radically, we'll be seeking your guidance yet again. Thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure. Really a pleasure to be with you.